Welcome to the fifth and final part of our series of videos demonstrating how easy it is to install and configure Customizer Lite. This is David Bell, Senior Development Manager and a member of the squad responsible for the Customizer technology at HCL Software. At the end of part 4, we had successfully demonstrated modifying the behavior of Connections homepage using Customizer. If you want to try and test customizations or run in a proof of concept or just a small scale deployment, you can effectively stop there. The implementation is functionally complete. This last video deals with enhancing the deployment to make it more resilient to single points of failure in the various service components. For this to work successfully, you need the Customizer Lite zip package that was produced as part of the Connections CR6 delivery. The date stamp of that zip package should be 25th of September 2019 or later. If you cast your mind back to part 1 of the series, I showed this diagram to illustrate the various components in the deployment. Then in parts 2 and 3, we installed Docker, Docker Compose, the Docker images and configurations for the 3 Customizer-related microservices. And in part 4, we put Nginx in front of the deployment to coordinate requests to access the services. This represents the current and fully functional state of the implementation. Part of the installation process has to be repeated to establish additional physical or virtual machines on which to run the microservices. While 2 instances are probably enough for most environments, there is no inherent reason it could not be 3 or 4 if necessary. The Nginx configuration will be updated so that requests for certain URIs have multiple possible upstream destinations, corresponding to the multiple instances of the microservices. The purpose behind this is to provide a level of protection against software or hardware failures in the various components. To establish the HA model with 2 instances of the services, the software stack is duplicated on another host, again either physical or virtual. The updated diagram shows a pair of Nginx proxy load balancer nodes, which could themselves have an alternative network device like an F5 or simply round-robin DNS to bounce requests to them as well. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to keep just a single Nginx node, but show how it is reconfigured to direct requests at the multiple microservices behind it. Before we get into the details of the configuration changes, just a word or two about request flows. Again, from part 1 of the series, I used this diagram to illustrate the general flow of requests between the various components in the Customizer Lite deployment model. The points to note that you'll see change are that the service instances will increase from 1 to 2. They will use shared storage rather than a local file system for configuration and data files. An admin request to the Appregistry client and service will no longer be routed via the HTTP server. Here is the updated version of the diagram. Note that the microservices are connected to a shared storage device. Moving the configuration files that we looked at in part 3 of the series to shared storage, from where each host can remotely mount them, means only one set of files to configure and ensures consistent configuration across the nodes, rather than maintaining separate copies of the same configuration files on each node, which could lead to inconsistency. Because the IBM HTTP server does not support any kind of load balancing that is not plugin based, it cannot readily be used to balance requests across multiple instances of the Appregistry client and Appregistry service. During the reconfiguration of Nginx, we will change those request flows to be handled by Nginx instead of the HTTP server. Since Customizer also makes requests of the Appregistry service, we need to indicate in the Mw-Proxy configuration how to make use of Nginx for that purpose instead of the HTTP server. This was one of the enhancements made in the Mw-Proxy service and delivered in CR6 to support this model and is described on the next slide. In a single Docker or Kubernetes managed environment, the service reference Appregistry-service name is sufficient for the Mw-Proxy service to locate and make requests. In a multiple Docker node deployment without Kubernetes, this would resolve only to each local Docker host, thus not removing that single point of failure. An Mw-Proxy could only connect to the instance of Appregistry service on the same Docker host. To get around this limitation, an environment variable can be defined in the docker compose.yaml file in the Mw-Proxy environment section, and its presence tells Mw-Proxy to explicitly use that reference instead of the default Appregistry service name. The Appregistry_service_proxy variable takes the form of a URL and port if required. In the default case, this is constructed by referencing the same Nginx_URL environment variable as defined by the .env file. In the interest of time, I already have a second machine ready to run. I'm not going to demo installation of Docker and Docker Compose again, nor mounting shared storage into a file system. I'll show the configuration files in their new shared storage location, and then we'll make the necessary configuration changes to support the HA deployment. Since the Docker images are already in a Docker repository, they should already be accessible to any machine on which the containers will run, so there should be no need to change as far as Docker images are concerned. Then the microservices can be restarted and we'll check that the customizations are still functional. Let's do it. As in previous demo components, I wanted to reference the Installing Customizer Lite documentation here. There are some items relevant to Customizer Lite HA deployment. If we scroll down the page here, you will see under About This Task, if I turn on here, a distinction between how many times the various steps below need to be run through and which ones are specific to Customizer Lite HA. In fact, if the files are put on a shared storage volume from the outset, then you should only need to run through the setup once, and then as you add more nodes, they can share the same files. In our demo here, we set up the files on a local file system, and so I'm going to talk about moving those files to a shared location instead. But you may start out that way if you plan to expand the deployment into HA, and you know that at the start. Scrolling a little bit further down, let's turn off the arrow. You'll see item number 7 here. References Customizer Lite HA only, and it talks about the editing of the Docker Compose.yaml file to add in the reference to the Appregistry service proxy, which we just covered in the previous slide. I just want to point out that the reference here says HTTP, and in fact it should be HTTPS to make our lives a little bit easier and not have to do quite so much change in Nginx. Hopefully that will be updated shortly in the documentation. So let's get on to our customizer node here, where we have the original configuration. And just for complete transparency, I have actually moved the files into a directory called var NFS. So the previous Customizer Lite configuration files that we had for the standalone implementation are here. There they are. And that directory is shared or exported, as you see here, var NFS with the two customizer nodes. So my 2 machines that will run the microservices. So I'm really simulating shared storage here. I didn't put them on an actual shared storage volume, but the principle is fine for demonstration purposes. And just to show how those things are mounted, let me run here. You'll see that the SRV Customizer Lite directory is mounted to the shared var NFS Customizer Lite directory. This is on node 1, and if I go to node 2, it's the same command. You'll see that the local SRV Customizer Lite directory here is mounted to that same var NFS Customizer Lite shared directory on node 1. And if we go to that directory, we can see the same set of files exist or are referenced. So we should only need to edit those in one place. And we are editing the Docker Compose YAML file in the scripts directory. And in the Mw-Proxy environment section, we need to add the Appregistry _ service proxy environment variable. And just tidy up the format, since spacing does matter. save that. And I had already shut down the Docker images, and on both, they're not running on either of these machines. So the next step then was to bring up those services again, update all, actually do it from the server, Customizer Lite directory, update all, and now we've restarted the services. The last thing we want to do was check that we had not disrupted anything and that our customizations are still working, even though we're only running with a single set of services at this point. And there we see, welcome to Customizer Lite. And at this point, we should be able to go to node 2 scripts directory and bring up the services on this node as well. So if we look at node 1, we should have 3 running services, started 2 minutes ago. And if we look at node 2, we should have 3 other services, started a few seconds ago. So now we have our 3 sets of services, each running on 2 separate physical nodes, or actually virtual machines, but they are separate instances of the operating system. But at this point, Nginx is still only referencing the Customizer 01 node. So even though the services are running here, they're not participating in anything we're doing right now. And so the next part of our demo will be to update Nginx to make use of both. Changing Nginx requires telling it the multiple hosts on which it can find each of the services using upstream application definitions. The location proxy path directives then need to reference those application definitions instead of the single discrete host name that is in place already. After restarting Nginx, we can then verify that access to the microservices works, and furthermore, if any service is not available on one host, then the request is routed to the other available host. All of this comes together when we continue to see the customizations being applied successfully, even if there is a failure in the individual services. Now that we've got our microservices configuration ready and services running on both nodes, we can go ahead and change Nginx to make use of the multiple instances of each service. So we need to update the Nginx configuration. And copy some things in here. The way that we tell Nginx that it has multiple hosts for a given URI is to use something called the upstream directive. I'm going to put it in here just before these proxy directives. And they're pretty self-explanatory. You can certainly look up the upstream directive in the Nginx documentation. And what we do here is we give a label to the application or the set of nodes that reference the particular service that we're interested in. So we have Mw-Proxy nodes, we have Appregistry service nodes, we have Appregistry client nodes, and within the definition, we reference each host and port number as necessary that is able to service requests for the service. So we have microservices running on Customizer 1 and Customizer 2 nodes, and therefore we have 2 server definitions in each block. And they can be different ports if for some reason you need to have the services run on different ports on different machines. That can be accommodated here. And by default, we're using we're using a standard round robin balancing method. So without any other explicit balancing criteria, Nginx will just fire requests evenly balanced at each of the 2 hosts, unless one is not available. weighted round robin is a slightly different variation on that, which is that you can say I want some percentage of the requests to go to one node versus another, and Nginx will keep track of that. But in this case, we're saying there are two nodes available, and under normal circumstances, you can just send the requests in sort of an even quantity to the two different nodes. So that's the first part, the upstream directives. And now we need to change the location directives so that instead of referencing just the specific node, we reference those upstream blocks by their application name. And that is how we make the connection between which URI request goes to which upstream host and port. So these are going to the Mw-Proxy nodes, copy and paste. Oh, we need one semicolon. And because we also want Nginx to route to Appregistry service and Appregistry client and balance those requests, you saw I added the upstream directives for those two services, but we need to add location rules as well for those services. So let me copy those in. And tidy up the formatting a little bit. So what this first one says is any request that comes in that starts with Appregistry, we want to pass that on to the Appregistry service nodes. And the second one here, any request that comes in with Appreg, and we're doing a little bit more work here in this rule, which I'll explain in a second. We want to pass that on to the Appregistry client nodes. Oop, didn't indent location far enough. Okay. The rewrite directives here simply strip the Appreg component of the URI, and that's a little bit of an anomaly in terms of how the Appregistry client microservice works in on-premises versus cloud. The the rules here that you see are documented in the public documentation. Let me just go back to that page. And you'll see here there's a link at the bottom of the install which talks about configuring Nginx for Customizer Lite HA. If you scroll down this page, I think it's item number 3 here, you'll see the examples of what we just added to there's a couple of different examples here, some extra locations, but fundamentally we have the Appregistry rule, the Appreg rule, the rule for homepage, which is the only one we're using right now, and then the catch-all for the IHS server for all of the requests. So you can find that and copy and paste those things from there as well. And that should be good. So we can save that and stop and start Nginx. Start. Oops. Something not right with the config. So what did we change? Oh, forgot the semicolons on the end of the lines. See, we are live here. Let's try that again. Start. Hey, that's better. Make sure we're services are running. That looks good. Okay. So let's go back to our browser, and the services are running on both nodes. Let's just refresh, make sure we still see our customization. Welcome to Customizer Lite. And now let's go to node 1, which is traditionally where all of these services were running, and shut them down. And just make sure they are not running. No containers there. Go back to our page, refresh. Now we should be picking up services from nodes 2. Customization is there again, and just to finally prove that it really is live, let's go to, oops, can't type. The actual JavaScript of that customization, where we see the text, welcome to Customizer Lite, and how about we say Customizer Lite HA, and go back to our browser and refresh, and there is our modified customization served up from node 2, since those are the only ones that are active. And so that concludes a successful demonstration of Customizer Lite HA. And so with that, we reached the end of our 5-part series on Customizer Lite deployment. I hope you enjoyed the series and that it's been helpful in demonstrating a Customizer Lite implementation. This was David Bell, Senior Development Manager at HCL Software. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.